The boarding line moved slowly, the hum of announcements echoing through the airport. A man in his late 30s shuffled forward with his young daughter by his side. His ticket read Seat 12F. The man's clothes were simply jeans, a worn jacket, and a duffel bag that had clearly seen years of use. He looked like any other weary traveler, a single dad simply trying to get home. His name was Daniel Hayes. To anyone watching, he seemed ordinary, a father with tired eyes, a calm demeanor, and a little girl who clutched his hand as though the world beyond him didn't exist. But behind his quiet presence was a past no one on that plane could have guessed. Daniel and his daughter, Emily, boarded quietly. He helped her into her seat by the window and gave her a reassuring smile as she opened a small sketchbook. Drawing was her escape, her way of finding color in a world that often felt too heavy. Daniel settled into 12F, pulling out a paperback novel. The hum of the engines was calming, and for once, Daniel felt like this might be an uneventful flight. But uneventful wasn't written in his story. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, Daniel leaned his head back. Emily tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, can you tell me a story?" she asked, her eyes wide, her voice hopeful. He chuckled softly. "All right, Em, but just a short one before you nap." He began to tell her a story about courage and kindness, about people who give everything without expecting thanks. His words were soft, and a few passengers nearby, half asleep or pretending to be, found themselves listening. His voice had that kind of effect, a steady, soothing, almost commanding without trying to be. Midway through the flight, a minor medical issue stirred commotion. A passenger in the aisle across from Daniel began to panic, a shortness of breath, hands trembling. Flight attendants rushed, trying to assist. Daniel didn't hesitate. He rose, his calm voice cutting through the panic. "Give him space, raise his legs slightly, check his pulse." His tone wasn't frantic, it was sharp, trained, precise. The attendants followed without questioning, and within minutes, the man stabilized. The crisis had passed, and the attendants murmured gratitude. Daniel simply nodded and returned to his seat, brushing Emily's hair back from her forehead. It was then that two men in uniform, U.S. Air Force pilots traveling incognito, took notice. They had been sitting quietly several rows back. Something in Daniel's voice, the way he issued instructions, struck them. It wasn't just authority, it was familiarity. Hours later, as turbulence rattled the cabin, a brief announcement crackled over the PA. The pilot asked a curious question, almost light-hearted but laced with intent. "Is there anyone aboard with military experience?" There was silence for a moment. Then Daniel exhaled slowly. He wasn't the type to announce himself, but something compelled him. He raised his hand just slightly. "Seat 12F, he said quietly. The pilots 2 rows back stiffened. That call sign 12F. Not just a seat number, but a name they hadn't heard in years. In the Air Force, it had belonged to a man whispered about like legend. A commander who had flown F-22 Raptors with impossible precision. A pilot who had led missions others wouldn't dare attempt. A man who had disappeared into civilian life without ceremony. One of the pilots turned, his eyes wide. "Zero broken bar, are you a broken bar?" Daniel gave the smallest shake of his head, as though to quiet the past. "I'm just a dad now," he said softly. But the look in his eyes was unmistakable. By the time the plane landed, word had spread quietly among the crew. The pilots approached him on the tarmac, standing straighter than they had in years. They weren't looking at a weary single father anima. They were standing at attention, honoring the call sign that had once saved their lives. Emily tugged on his hand, confused. "Daddy, why are they looking at you like that?" Daniel knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Because sometimes, Em, the world remembers what you try to forget." The pilots exchanged a look of deep respect. "With all due respect, Zero broken bar, you don't belong in the shadows." But Daniel only smiled faintly. "The most important mission I have left is raising her." Over the next weeks, word quietly spread through the community, and never in headlines, never in news reports, but in whispers. A former decorated pilot, now living a modest life as a single dad, carrying his burdens quietly but with dignity. Neighbors noticed the kindness in him, how he helped elderly tenants carry groceries, how he fixed the broken basketball hoop at the local park so kids could play, how he never spoke of himself but always asked about others. Emily, with her bright sketches and laughter, began to heal from the loss of her mother. Daniel had shielded her from the weight of his past, determined that her world would be filled with love instead of sacrifice. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Daniel received a letter. It was not from the Air Force, it was from one of the pilots who had recognized him on that flight. The letter spoke of gratitude, of lives saved, of inspiration. But the last line read, "You may not wear the uniform anymore, but men like you never stop serving humanity." Daniel folded the letter, tucking it into Emily's sketchbook where he kept her best drawings. For him, that was service in awe for knowing that his daughter saw him not as a hero from the skies, but as the man who tucked her in every night and whispered stories about courage. Months later, he was walking Emily to school when a low rumble filled the sky. He glanced up to see a formation of F-22s flying in perfect precision. For a moment, he froze, memories flooding back. The jets tilted their wings slightly, a silent salute. Emily looked up, eyes wide. "Daddy, are they waving at you?" Daniel smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "Maybe. But today, let's wave back." And in that moment, standing on the sidewalk with his daughter's hand in his, Daniel Hayes, the man once known only by his call signal, understood something he hadn't before. Heroism wasn't always in the skies, in missions, or in uniforms. Sometimes, it was in the quiet strength of staying, of raising, of loving. Seat 12F had been just another spot on a plane. But for those who knew, it was a reminder that even when legends fade into ordinary lives, their light never really goes out. Daniel kept walking, blending into the crowd, just a single dad with a little girl at his side. To the world, he was ordinary. But to those who had once stood at attention in his presence, he would always be extraordinary. And he wouldn't have it any other way.